With only $8 in her coat pocket and a garbage bag holding everything she owned, 67-year-old Cecile Pruitt stood in the middle of a muddy salvage yard in Clarksburg, West Virginia, staring at a rusted, padlocked train car that nobody had opened in over a century. Her own children had thrown her out 3 days earlier, calling her a burden they were no longer willing to carry. But what Brandon and Tamara didn't know, what nobody in that forgotten corner of West Virginia could have ever predicted, was that the $8 Cecile spent on that locked, abandoned train car at a county salvage auction would lead to a discovery so extraordinary, so historically significant, that it would not only save her life, but rewrite an entire chapter of American industrial history. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. To understand how Cecile Pruitt ended up bidding $8 on a rusted train car with nothing but a garbage bag to her name, you have to go back to the beginning, not to the salvage yard, not to the auction, but to the woman she was before life stripped everything away from her, layer by layer, until there was almost nothing left. Cecile was born and raised in Clarksburg, West Virginia, the second of 4 children in a working-class family that never had much money but always had pride. Her father worked the railroad, her mother cleaned houses and took in laundry. From the time she was old enough to hold a broom, Cecile understood that dignity wasn't something handed to you, it was something you built, quietly, stubbornly, one honest day at a time. She married young. His name was Gerald Pruitt, a soft-spoken man who worked at the local lumber mill and loved crossword puzzles and strong coffee. They weren't wealthy, not even close, but they built a modest life together in a small 2-bedroom house on Canary Street that Gerald bought with years of careful saving. They had 2 children. Brandon came first, in 1978, a serious, ambitious boy who always had his eye on something bigger than Clarksburg. Tamara came 3 years later, sharper and louder than her brother, the kind of girl who argued her way out of every punishment and charmed her way into every opportunity. Cecile raised them both mostly on her own. Gerald was a good man, but he was not a well man. He suffered from chronic back problems that worsened through his 40s and eventually forced him out of the mill entirely. The medical bills came slowly at first, then all at once, like a dam giving way. Cecile took 2 jobs to keep the house. She worked the early shift at a diner called Patsy's on Route 19 starting at 5:30 in the morning, then cleaned offices for a property management company 3 afternoons a week. She did this for 11 years without complaint, without asking anyone for help, without once letting her children see how close to the edge the family was living. She made sure Brandon had new shoes when the school year started. She made sure Tamara had the right textbooks, the right dress for the winter formal, the right sense that the world was open to her even when their bank account said otherwise. Cecile skipped meals to cover utility bills. She wore her winter coat 3 seasons past when it should have been replaced. She told herself it didn't matter. What mattered was that her children had what they needed to build their own futures. And they did. Brandon graduated near the top of his class and left Clarksburg on a partial scholarship to study business in Columbus, Ohio. He never really came back, not in any meaningful way. He built a career in corporate finance, married a woman named Diane who wore expensive perfume and referred to Clarksburg as that town, and settled into a comfortable life in a suburb of Cincinnati. He called on birthdays sometimes and at Christmas usually. Tamara followed a different path but arrived at the same destination. She went to cosmetology school, built a successful salon business in Charleston, and married twice. Her second husband, a contractor named Phil, had money and opinions and a clear sense that Cecile didn't quite fit into the life Tamara was building. Gerald passed away in 2014, quietly in the same bedroom where they'd slept for 31 years. Cecile held his hand when he went. She arranged the funeral on a budget so tight she had to borrow $400 from a neighbor named Ruthann to cover the casket. Neither Brandon nor Tamara offered to help with the cost. They attended the service, said the right things, hugged their mother at the graveside, and went back to their lives within 48 hours. After Gerald died, Cecile stayed in the house on Canary Street. It was paid off, left to her outright, one of the few things Gerald had managed to protect through all the medical debt. On her Social Security income of all $1,140 a month and her part-time hours at Patsy's Diner, she managed. Barely, but she managed. She kept the yard clean. She kept herself clean. She kept her dignity intact the way her parents had taught her, quietly and stubbornly, one honest day at a time. That was the woman Cecile Pruitt had always been. Not loud, not demanding, not a burden to anyone. Just a mother who had given everything she had for decades and asked for nothing in return, not even gratitude. She should have known that wouldn't be enough. She should have known that some debts don't get repaid, they just get forgotten. But Cecile, who had spent her whole life believing in people, didn't see it coming until the morning her children sat her down in her own living room and told her it was time to go. It was a Tuesday in October when Brandon and Tamara came to Clarksburg together. That alone should have told Cecile something was wrong. Her children hadn't been in the same room since Gerald's funeral, and even then they'd barely spoken to each other. The fact that they'd coordinated, driven in from different cities, and arrived at the same time on a Tuesday morning meant they had planned this. Whatever was about to happen had been decided long before either of them walked through her front door. Cecile had made coffee. She'd even put out a plate of the shortbread cookies she kept in the cabinet above the stove, the ones Brandon had loved as a boy. She'd told herself it was just a visit, maybe a surprise. Maybe they were finally coming around to being present in her life the way she'd always quietly hoped. She'd smoothed her hair in the hallway mirror before opening the door and smiled at the sight of both of them standing on her porch. That smile didn't last long. They sat down in the living room. Brandon took the armchair across from the couch where Cecile sat. Tamara sat beside her brother, which itself was unusual. They were presenting a united front, and Cecile felt the room shift even before anyone spoke. "Mom," Brandon started, in the voice she recognized as his business voice, the one he used when he'd already made a decision and was just delivering the result. "We need to talk about your situation." Cecile kept her hands folded in her lap. "What situation is that?" "This house," Tamara said, glancing around the living room as if assessing it. "It's getting to be too much for you. The roof has that leak you mentioned in the spring. The furnace is old. The property taxes went up again this year." "I've been managing," Cecile said carefully. "You've been struggling," Brandon corrected. "Mom, you're 67 years old. You're working part-time at a diner. You can barely cover your expenses. We've been talking, and we think it's time for a real plan." They had a plan, all right. They had researched it, printed documents, and brought a folder. The folder sat on Brandon's knee, and seeing it made Cecile's stomach drop before he even opened it. 6 months earlier, at another family dinner that had felt slightly too organized in retrospect, Brandon had suggested that Cecile put both their names on the deed to the house. For tax purposes, he'd said, to make things easier if something ever happened to her. No probate, no complications. "We're family. We'll make sure you're taken care of." She had signed the paperwork without reading every line. She had trusted her son. Why wouldn't she? He was her son. Now Brandon opened the folder and laid out what that signature had made possible. They had found a buyer for the house on Canary Street, a young couple from out of town who wanted to renovate. The offer was $210,000. Cecile's share after costs would be used to fund her placement at a residential care facility in Morgantown called Sunrise Gardens. Cecile asked to see the brochure. It showed cheerful photographs of elderly residents playing cards and tending small potted plants. A single room with a narrow bed and a window overlooking a parking lot. The monthly cost was $2,800. "My social security is $1,440, Cecile said quietly. "The house sale covers the difference for several years," Tamara said, not quite meeting her eyes. "And after that we'll figure something out." "Figure something out," Cecile repeated. "Mom, you can't keep living here alone," Brandon said, his voice carrying the particular edge of someone who has rehearsed their argument and is frustrated that it isn't landing cleanly. "What if you fall? What if the furnace gives out in January? You're isolated here. It's not safe." "I've lived in this house for 31 years, Cecile said. "I raised you in this house." "We know," Tamara said, "and we're grateful. But things change. You're a burden, Mom." Brandon said it without flinching, without dropping his eyes, without any apparent awareness of what those words cost to hear. "Not intentionally, but you are. The calls about the roof, the worry about whether you're eating properly, whether the heat is working. We have our own families. We have responsibilities. We can't keep carrying this." The word landed like something physical. Burden. Cecile sat with it for a moment, turning it over in her mind, the way you turn over a rock and look at what's underneath. "When do you need me out?" she asked finally. They looked slightly surprised, as if they'd expected more of a fight. Brandon recovered first. "The closing is in 3 weeks. The facility has a room available on the 1st of next month. We can arrange movers for your personal things." They left shortly after. They didn't offer to help her pack. They didn't ask if she needed money for the interim. Tamara paused at the door and said something about it being for the best. Brandon said he'd call her at the end of the week. Neither of them called. On the morning of October 28th, Cecile Pruitt packed what she could carry into 2 garbage bags and 1 small duffel. 31 years of living reduced to what fit in her arms. She left the furniture, the dishes, the curtains she'd sewn herself, the garden tools, Gerald's old crossword puzzle books stacked beside the back door. She left it all. She walked out of the house on Canary Street at 9:15 in the morning and didn't look back. Not because it didn't hurt, but because looking back would have broken something in her that she wasn't sure she could fix. She had $43 in her wallet and nowhere to go. Cecile spent the first night in the parking lot of a Salvation Army shelter on Monroe Avenue that had no available beds but allowed her to sit in the waiting area until 11 p.m. When they locked the doors, she walked 3 blocks to a covered bus stop and sat on the cold metal bench with her garbage bags at her feet and her duffel on her lap, and watched the streetlights reflect off the wet pavement until morning came. She didn't cry. She'd done her crying privately, in the bathroom of the shelter waiting room, with the faucet running so nobody would hear. Out here on the bench, she kept her face still and her eyes forward. She was 67 years old, and she had nothing, but she still had her dignity, and dignity, she had learned from her mother, was the one thing nobody could take from you unless you handed it over yourself. The second day she found a church on Elm Street that served hot breakfast to anyone who came through the door without asking questions. She ate oatmeal and drank black coffee and sat at a long folding table beside a man named Curtis who had lost his job at the rail yard 8 months ago, and a young woman with a toddler on her lap who didn't give her name. Cecile didn't give hers either. They ate in the particular silence of people who understand each other without needing to explain anything. She spent the second night on a bench in Deegan Park, with a sheet of cardboard she'd found behind a grocery store laid across her legs for warmth. The temperature dropped to 41 degrees. She pulled every piece of clothing she owned from the garbage bags and put them on in layers and told herself that she had survived harder things than a cold night on a park bench, though at that particular moment she was struggling to remember what those things were. On the morning of the third day, she found the notice. She had gone back to the church for breakfast and afterwards sat in the small reading room off the main hall where donated magazines and newspapers were kept in a wire rack by the window. She wasn't looking for anything in particular. She was simply trying to stay warm and occupy her mind with something other than the arithmetic of her situation, which, no matter how she calculated it, refused to add up to anything survivable. The notice was tucked inside a copy of the Clarksburg Courier from 2 days earlier, folded open to the classified section, a small box near the bottom of the page, easy to miss, the kind of announcement that most people would scroll past without a second look. Harrison County Salvage Auction. Saturday, November 1st, 10 a.m. Glendale Rail Yard, off Route 7. Surplus and abandoned property including vehicles, equipment and rolling stock. Minimum bid $1, cash only. All sales final, no warranties expressed or implied. Cecile read the notice twice. Then she looked at the date on the newspaper. Today was Thursday, October 30th. The auction was in 2 days. She sat back in her chair and thought about it carefully. She had $38 left after buying a pair of thick socks at the dollar store the previous afternoon. She had nowhere to sleep that was warm or safe. She had no family willing to take her in and no friends with space to spare. The assisted living facility Brandon and Tamara had selected required a deposit she couldn't pay and a guarantor she didn't have. She was going to be homeless regardless of what she did next. The only question was whether she would be homeless with nothing to her name or homeless with something, even if that something was unclear. Even if it was a long shot. Even if it was the kind of idea that sounds desperate because it is desperate. She tore the notice carefully from the newspaper, folded it and put it in her coat pocket. Saturday morning she was at the Glendale Rail Yard by 9:30. The yard was a wide, flat expanse of gravel and dead grass bordered by chain-link fencing on 3 sides and backed by a tree line on the 4th. Rusted equipment sat in rows, old backhoes, stripped vehicle frames, coils of cable, engine parts so corroded they were barely identifiable. A small crowd had already gathered near a folding table where a heavy-set man in an orange vest was arranging paperwork. This was Harvey Dodd, the county auctioneer, a man who had the efficient, slightly bored energy of someone who had sold other people's abandoned things for a living for too long. About 40 people milled around the yard, Mostly men in work jackets, contractors and scrappers and small-time dealers who knew how to spot value in other people's cast-offs. They walked the rows with practiced eyes, kicking tires, lifting lids, making calculations. Nobody paid Cecile any attention. A small, older woman with 2 garbage bags and a duffel coat was not their competition. She walked the rows slowly, looking at everything, knowing she couldn't afford most of it, knowing she needed something she could actually use. Then she saw the train car. It sat at the far end of the yard, half hidden behind a row of rusted equipment, separated from everything else as if even the other abandoned things wanted nothing to do with it. It was an old wooden freight car, probably built sometime in the early 20th century, maybe earlier. The wood was dark with age and weather, the metal fittings along the sides red with rust. It sat on a section of disconnected track that ended abruptly in the gravel, going nowhere. What stopped Cecile wasn't the car itself, it was the door. The freight door on the side of the car was secured with a heavy iron padlock, old and thick, the kind they stopped making decades ago. Everything else in this yard had been picked over, stripped, opened, emptied. This car had never been opened. Whatever was inside it had been locked away and left, and nobody, in however many years this car had been sitting in this yard, had bothered to find out what that was. Cecile stood in front of it for a long moment, with her hands in her coat pockets and the cold November wind moving through the yard around her. Then Harvey Dodd called everyone to attention, and the auction began. The auction moved quickly. Harvey Dodd had the practiced rhythm of a man who wanted to be done by noon. He worked through the rows methodically, calling out each item, taking bids, hammering his clipboard like a gavel when a sale was made. The contractors bid on the heavy equipment. The scrappers fought over the metal coils and engine parts. Everyone seemed to know what they wanted before they arrived, and the whole thing had the feeling of a transaction that had already been decided, with the auction itself just a formality. Cecile stood near the back of the crowd and waited. When Dodd finally reached the train car, he stopped in front of it and consulted his clipboard with the expression of a man reading something he doesn't quite believe. "All right, last item of the day," he announced, loud enough to carry across the yard. "What we have here is one wooden freight car, origin and date of manufacture unknown, donated to the county by the estate of Harlan Griggs, deceased, who apparently collected things without asking too many questions. Car is sitting on approximately 30 feet of disconnected track which is included in the sale. Condition is what you see. Nobody has been inside. Nobody knows what's inside. The padlock is original and the key, if there ever was one, is not in our possession." A murmur ran through the crowd. A few people walked closer to look. Most of them stayed where they were. "We will not be breaking the lock prior to sale," Dodd continued. "You buy it, you open it, whatever's inside is yours. Could be empty, could be full of bats." A few people laughed. "Minimum bid is $1. Who wants to start?" Silence. One of the contractors near the front shrugged and said something to the man beside him. A scrapper in a green jacket walked around the car once, knocked on the wood in 2 places, shook his head and walked away. The car was too far from the road to move easily and too deteriorated to have obvious scrap value. Nobody wanted the liability of hauling it out of the yard. $1, Dodd repeated, with the patience of a man who had done this before. "Anybody?" $8, Cecile said from the back of the crowd. Every head turned. The reaction was almost identical to what she'd expected. The same slow survey, the same assessment, the same conclusion. Small, older woman, garbage bags at her feet, absolutely no business being here. $8 from the lady in the back, Dodd said, his voice carefully neutral. "Do I hear 9? Lady, you don't even know what's in there," the scrapper in the green jacket called out, not cruelly but with genuine bewilderment. "Could be nothing, could be worse than nothing." $8, Cecile repeated evenly. Dodd looked around the yard. Nobody moved, nobody raised a hand. Whatever was behind that padlock, nobody here wanted it badly enough to spend $9 finding out. "Going once at $8, Dodd said. "Going twice." He paused. "Sold." "Ma'am, please come up and complete your paperwork." She counted out 8 single-dollar bills on the folding table while Dodd filled out the transfer form. The scrapper in the green jacket watched her do it and shook his head slowly. One of the contractors said something under his breath that made the man beside him smirk. Cecile kept her eyes on the paperwork and her hands steady. Dodd handed her a receipt and a single document confirming transfer of ownership. "You'll need to arrange removal of the car within 60 days, he said. "County can't store it indefinitely." "I understand," Cecile said. "You need help getting into it? I'll manage." Getting to the train car proved to be its own challenge. Cecile had no car and no money for a taxi. She asked Dodd if there was anyone at the yard who could give her a ride, explaining that she intended to stay with the car, that it was her property now and she had nowhere else to go. She said it plainly, without embarrassment, the way her mother had taught her to say hard truths. Dodd stared at her for a long moment. Then he called across the yard to a younger man who'd been helping with the equipment. "Owen, give this lady a hand." Owen Gable was a quiet man in his early 60s with a graying beard and the broad, careful hands of someone who had spent decades working with wood. He loaded Cecile's bags into his truck without comment and drove her the 4 miles to where the rail yard's back section sat adjacent to a narrow access road off Route 7. He helped her carry her bags across the gravel to the train car and stood looking at it with her for a moment without speaking. "You're planning to stay here," he said finally. It wasn't quite a question. "I am," Cecile said. Owen reached into his truck bed and came back with a heavy bolt cutter. "Lock's old," he said. "Probably won't take much." He was right. 2 attempts and the shackle gave way, the old iron separating with a sound like a gunshot in the cold air. The freight door required both of them pulling together to slide it open along its rusted track. It moved inch by inch, groaning and resisting, until it was open wide enough to step through. The smell that came out was old and dry and strangely clean, like the inside of a cedar chest that had been sealed for a very long time. Owen shone his flashlight inside. The beam moved across the interior slowly. Cecile stepped up and in, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. The train car was not empty. Along both interior walls, secured with wooden brackets that had been custom fitted, were rows of large wooden crates, 12 of them, maybe more. Each one was sealed, each one labeled in careful black stenciling that had faded but was still legible. The floor was thick with dust but otherwise intact, the old hardwood boards solid beneath her feet. Owen lowered his flashlight. "Well," he said quietly, "it's not bats." Cecile stood in the middle of her $8 train car and looked at the crates around her and felt something she hadn't felt in 4 days. Not hope exactly. Something quieter than that. The sense that the world was not entirely finished with her yet. "Thank you for your help," she told Owen. He left her his flashlight, a bottle of water from behind his seat, and a telephone number on a scrap of paper. "My workshop is 2 miles down Route 7, he said. "You need anything, you come find me." He paused at the door. "I'll bring a proper lantern tomorrow." He drove away. Cecile sat down on the floor of the train car, with her back against one of the crates and the flashlight balanced on her knee. Outside, the wind moved through the trees at the edge of the yard. The temperature was dropping toward freezing. Through the open freight door, she could see the first stars appearing in the darkening sky. She had $8 worth of train car, 12 sealed crates, and a flashlight with an unknown amount of battery life. She pulled her coat tighter and told herself it was enough. Tonight it had to be. The first week was the hardest thing Cecile Pruitt had ever done, and she had done hard things her entire life. The train car provided shelter in the most basic sense of the word. It had walls and a roof and a floor, and after Owen returned the next morning with a heavy lantern and helped her slide the freight door, mostly shut against the cold, it was at least protected from the wind. But it was not warm. The wooden walls, though surprisingly solid for their age, had gaps where the boards had shrunk and separated over decades of freeze and thaw. At night, the temperature inside dropped low enough that Cecile could see her breath and had to sleep fully dressed with both garbage bags emptied and wrapped around herself for additional insulation. She solved the immediate problems one at a time, the way her mother had taught her to approach anything overwhelming. Don't look at the whole mountain. Pick up one stone. Water first. There was a spigot on the exterior wall of the main salvage yard office, left running slightly to prevent freezing. The yard manager, a taciturn man named Dale who communicated mostly in nods and shrugs, didn't object when Cecile began filling an old plastic jug she found in the yard. She took that as permission and didn't ask for more than that. Food next. She had $35 remaining after the auction. 2 miles down Route 7, past Owen's workshop and a shuttered gas station, there was a small general store called Fontaine's that sold groceries and hardware and seemed to sell everything else as well, the way small rural stores do when they are the only option for miles. The owner was a woman named Nadine Cross, compact and direct, with close-cropped silver hair and the efficient manner of someone who had been running things alone for a long time. Cecile bought rice, dried beans, a box of crackers, and a small jar of peanut butter. The total came to $18.40. While Nadine made change, she looked at Cecile with the careful, non-intrusive attention of a woman who notices things without making a performance of noticing. "You're the one who bought the old freight car at the Glendale auction," Nadine said. "I am," Cecile confirmed. "Owen Gable mentioned it." Nadine set the change on the counter. "You planning to stay out there?" "I am." Nadine was quiet for a moment. "I open at 6. I need someone to stock shelves and clean the back room 3 mornings a week. Early work, done by 9. I pay $12 an hour cash." Cecile looked at her steadily. "When do I start?" "Monday," Nadine said. 6 sharp. It was the same kind of unexpected grace that Cecile had seen extended to her once before at the church breakfast table, and she accepted it the same way, quietly and completely, without making it smaller by overthanking it. The routine that developed over the following weeks was punishing but purposeful. 3 mornings a week she walked the 2 miles to Fontaine's in the dark, worked her 3 hours, and walked back. The other mornings she worked on the train car. Owen came by every few days, always with something useful: a wool blanket, a small camp stove that ran on propane canisters, a bag of old weather stripping he said he had no use for. Together they sealed the worst of the gaps in the walls using the weather stripping and strips of heavy canvas Owen cut from a tarp. The difference was immediate and significant. The car held warmth now, not much, but enough. The camp stove, used carefully in the open doorway to prevent carbon monoxide buildup, heated a small area adequately and allowed Cecile to cook her rice and beans properly. She built a sleeping platform from wooden pallets Owen salvaged from behind his workshop, raising herself off the cold floor and creating a space beneath for storage. She arranged her belongings with the precise economy of someone who has very little and intends to use all of it wisely. She swept the floor of the car daily, cleared the accumulated dust from the walls, and brought order to the space the way she had always brought order to difficult situations, methodically, without drama, one small improvement at a time. Her body, soft from years of lighter work, hardened quickly. The 2-mile walks twice daily in cold weather, the physical labor of cleaning and building and carrying, rebuilt muscles she hadn't used in years. Her hands developed calluses. Her back, which had ached constantly in the first week, strengthened and settled. She earned $108 her first week at Fontaine's. Combined with her remaining cash, it gave her enough to buy propane, more food, and a pair of heavy work gloves that changed the quality of her daily life more than almost anything else had. But she had not yet opened the crates. She had looked at them every day. She had run her hands along the stenciled labels, trying to read the faded lettering in the lantern light. She had knocked on the wood and listened to the solid sound that came back. She had thought about what might be inside, and deliberately stopped herself from speculating too much, because hope, she had learned, was a thing that needed to be rationed carefully when you were living this close to the edge. It was Owen who finally said what she had been thinking. He had stopped by on a Thursday afternoon in mid-November, bringing a second propane canister and a bag of apples from a tree in his yard. He sat on an upturned crate near the door and looked at the rows of sealed boxes along the walls with the expression of a man exercising considerable patience. "Cecile," he said finally, "those crates have been sitting there for 3 weeks." "I know," she said. "You're not curious." "I'm terrified," she said honestly. "What if they're empty? What if there's nothing in them worth anything? Right now, they're possibility. Once I open them, they're just boxes." Owen considered this seriously, the way he considered most things. "Or," he said, "there's something you haven't imagined yet." Cecile looked at the nearest crate. The stenciling on the side had been partially restored by careful cleaning with a damp cloth. She could read most of it now. J. Mari, Apparatus and Records, 1902. "Tomorrow," she said. "I'll open one tomorrow." She opened it that same evening alone, after Owen had gone home. She couldn't wait. She pried the lid carefully with a flathead screwdriver Owen had left behind, and lifted it away and held the lantern over the opening and looked inside. And the world changed. The first thing Cecile saw was paper. Hundreds of pages of it, stacked in careful bundles and wrapped in oilskin cloth that had preserved them against moisture with remarkable effectiveness. She lifted the top bundle gently and unwrapped it with hands that had begun shaking without her permission. The pages inside were yellowed at the edges but intact, covered in dense handwriting that was precise and angular and absolutely deliberate, the handwriting of someone who wrote as if every word cost something and intended to spend each one carefully. At the top of the first page, in larger letters underlined twice, were the words, "Field Record of Mechanical Observations and Applied Experiments. J. Murray, Clarksburg, West Virginia, January 1902. Cecile sat down on the floor of the train car with the bundle in her lap and the lantern held close and read. Josephine Mare, she learned over the next 2 hours, had been a woman who built things. The journals, for that is what they were, documented 11 years of mechanical experimentation conducted in a workshop Josephine had established on the outskirts of Clarksburg in the final years of the 19th century. She had been, according to her own carefully understated descriptions, an engineer in everything but official title, since official title was not something the world had been prepared to extend to women in 1899. The journals described experiments with steam pressure and mechanical valves. They described a device Josephine called a regulated thermal converter, a mechanism designed to capture waste heat from industrial steam engines and redirect it as usable energy, reducing fuel consumption significantly. She had built 3 working prototypes and documented each one in exhaustive detail, including precise measurements, material specifications, and performance observations recorded over months of testing. The language was technical, but the voice behind it was unmistakable. Josephine Mare was methodical, impatient with imprecision, quietly furious at the obstacles placed in her path, and absolutely certain of the value of what she was doing, even when no one around her agreed. One entry from 1904 read, "The men at the Consolidated Rail Office reviewed my converter drawings today. They were polite in the way that people are polite when they have already decided not to listen. I will build the 4th prototype regardless. The work does not require their belief to be valid." Cecile read that entry 3 times. Over the following evenings she worked through the remaining crates methodically, opening each one carefully and cataloging what she found. The crates contained all 12 journals covering the years 1899 to 1910. They contained detailed technical drawings rendered with extraordinary precision on heavy drafting paper, showing every component of Josephine's inventions from multiple angles with measurements noted in her careful hand. They contained correspondence, letters to and from engineers, patent offices, and railroad companies, most of the responses polite rejections, a few of them showing grudging interest that had apparently never been acted upon. And in the final crate, wrapped separately in multiple layers of oilskin and then in a length of heavy wool cloth, were the physical components of what Josephine had labeled Prototype 4. Brass fittings, machined to tolerances that would have been remarkable for the era. A cylindrical chamber of some unknown alloy, smaller than Cecile's fist, that showed no corrosion despite a century of storage. Connecting rods and valves, each one labeled with a small stamped number that corresponded to diagrams in the journals. The device was disassembled but complete, every piece present and accounted for, stored with the care of someone who fully intended to come back to it. Josephine had never come back. The journals stopped abruptly in 1910 with no explanation. The last entry simply described a successful test of a valve mechanism and ended mid-thought, as if she had set down her pen to attend to something and never returned. What had happened to Josephine Mare was not recorded anywhere in the crates. But what she had built and documented and preserved in this locked train car for over a century was extraordinary. Cecile sat in the middle of the open crates with journals spread around her and the lantern burning low, and thought about what she was looking at. She was not an engineer. She was not a historian or an academic. She was a 67-year-old woman who had cleaned diners and raised children and survived on $1,140 a month and recently learned to seal wall gaps with weather stripping. But she knew what she was looking at mattered. She knew it the same way she had known, sitting in that church reading room 3 weeks ago, that the auction notice mattered. Not because she could quantify the significance, but because she could feel the weight of it, the particular gravity of something that has been waiting a very long time to be found. She wrapped each journal carefully, replaced each bundle in its crate, and laid the prototype components back in their wool wrapping with the same reverence she would have used handling something sacred. Then she went to find Owen Gable. Owen came the next morning before 7, earlier than usual, as if he had sensed something had shifted. Cecile met him at the door of the train car, with the top journal in her hands, and the particular expression of someone who has been awake most of the night thinking about what they found. She showed him everything. She walked him through the crates one by one, letting him examine the journals, the drawings, the correspondence, the components of the fourth prototype. Owen was not a man who reacted quickly to things. He had the deliberate, unhurried quality of someone who had spent decades working with his hands and understood that careful attention was more useful than immediate opinion. He read several journal entries slowly. He held the brass fittings up to the light and turned them over in his broad hands. He studied one of the technical drawings for a long time without speaking. "Cecile," he said finally, "do you know who Josephine Marais was?" "Only what the journals tell me," she said. Owen set the drawing down carefully. "I need to make a phone call." He knew someone at the West Virginia University History Department, a former student of his daughter's who had become an academic and maintained the particular enthusiastic accessibility of researchers who genuinely love what they study. Her name was Dr. Elliot Vance, a historian specializing in American industrial history with a particular focus on the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Owen sent Dr. Vance photographs that afternoon, photographs of the journal covers, selected interior pages, the technical drawings, the stenciled crate labels, and the prototype components laid out on the floor of the train car in the winter light. He sent them with a carefully worded message explaining where they had been found and asking for a professional opinion. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Dr. Vance's response came the following morning and contained only 2 sentences before dissolving into a series of increasingly urgent questions. The 2 sentences were, "I need you to tell me exactly where these are. If these are what I think they are, this is the most significant industrial history find in this state in 30 years. He arrived 4 days later in a university vehicle packed with reference materials, a laptop, photographic equipment, and the barely contained energy of a man trying very hard to be professionally measured about something that was exciting him enormously. He was younger than Cecile had expected, somewhere in his early 40s, with wire-rimmed glasses and the slightly distracted manner of someone whose mind is always running slightly ahead of his surroundings. His professional composure lasted approximately 10 minutes. He moved through the crates with increasing speed, cross-referencing journal entries against materials on his laptop, comparing the technical drawings to reference documents he had brought, examining the prototype components with a magnifying glass. He made small sounds under his breath that were not quite words. He photographed everything twice. After 2 hours, he sat down on an upturned crate across from Cecile and looked at her with an expression that she would later describe to Nadine as a man realizing the map he has been studying for years just turned out to be real. "Josephine Marais," Dr. Vance said carefully, "is a name that appears in the historical record exactly twice. Once in a 1903 Patent Office rejection letter that was discovered in a university archive in 1987, and once in a single line in a railroad company ledger from 1905 recording payment for unspecified consulting work. That is the entirety of what the historical record contains about her." He paused. "Until now," he explained what the journals represented. Josephine Marais had been working on thermal energy recovery mechanisms decades before the concept entered mainstream industrial engineering. The regulated thermal converter she had designed and built was a functional prototype of a technology that would not be independently developed by mainstream engineers until the 1940s. Her documentation was meticulous enough to constitute a complete engineering record, not just notes but a replicable technical blueprint. The historical significance extended beyond the technology itself. Josephine's journals provided a first-person account of a woman operating as a professional engineer in 1899, navigating institutional resistance with a combination of determination and extraordinary competence, and producing work of genuine innovation entirely outside the systems that should have recognized and supported her. She had been erased, not dramatically, not through any single act of deliberate suppression, but through the accumulated indifference of institutions that had simply declined to see her. Cecile had found her. The verification process took 6 weeks. Dr. Vance worked with colleagues in engineering history and materials science to authenticate the journals and prototype components. The handwriting was matched to the single known sample from the 1903 patent letter. The metallurgical composition of the prototype components was consistent with materials available in West Virginia in the early 1900s. The technical drawings were assessed by a mechanical engineering historian who described them as representing a level of precision and conceptual sophistication that was, in his exact words, frankly astonishing for the era. The train car was officially designated a Site of Historical and Industrial Significance in February. With that designation came grant funding from the State Historical Preservation Office, enough to weatherproof and properly secure the car, install climate-controlled storage for the journals and prototype, and provide Cecile with a formal caretaker stipend. West Virginia University established a research partnership with the site. A small parking area was cleared from the gravel yard. A modest sign was installed beside the car reading, Mare Archive, established 1902, recovered 2024. Cecile stood in front of that sign on the morning it was installed and felt the particular satisfaction of someone who has done something that needed doing and done it without anyone's help or permission. Owen stood beside her with his hands in his jacket pockets. Nadine had closed the store for an hour and driven out to see it. Dr. Vance had sent flowers, which Cecile found both touching and impractical given that she had nowhere to put them, but appreciated genuinely. Her name appeared in the official historical record as discoverer and custodian of the Mare Archive. The woman who had been called a burden 4 months earlier was now listed in a state historical document as a contributor to the preservation of West Virginia's industrial heritage. She was still sleeping in the train car, but it was warm now, and it was hers, and she had earned every inch of it. Brandon and Tamara came on a Saturday in March, 4 months after they had left Cecile on the sidewalk with 2 garbage bags and $43. She was in the small garden she had started along the south side of the train car, turning the first soft soil of early spring with a hand trowel Owen had brought her when she heard the car pull onto the gravel access road. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. She recognized the particular sound of Brandon's expensive engine, the way you recognize anything that once defined your life before it stopped being part of it. She set down the trowel and stood and brushed the dirt from her hands and waited. They stepped out together, the same united front as October, the same carefully arranged expressions of concerned reasonableness. They were dressed well, as always. They looked uncomfortable on the gravel, as always. They took in the train car, the modest sign beside it, the small parking area, the climate-controlled storage unit visible through the open freight door, with expressions that moved through surprise and calculation so quickly that most people would have missed the sequence entirely. Cecile did not miss it. "Mom," Brandon said, his voice carrying that particular warmth that surfaces when people want something. "You look well." "I am well," Cecile replied evenly. "We've been trying to reach you," Tamara said. "I know. I got your messages." She had gotten 4 of them, all arriving after the local news ran a brief segment about the Mare Archive discovery. The timing was not subtle. Brandon gestured at the train car and the sign. "We heard about all this. It's remarkable, Mom. Really, we had no idea." "No," Cecile agreed. "You didn't." The silence that followed had weight to it. Tamara broke it first, which was always how it had worked. Tamara was the one who said the uncomfortable thing while Brandon stood behind the position she established. "We made mistakes," Tamara said, "in October. The way things were handled, the things that were said, we know that." "Do you?" Cecile said. "It was not a question. We were overwhelmed," Brandon said. "Our own pressures, our own situations. We made decisions that were wrong. We can see that now." Cecile looked at her son for a long moment. He was 45 years old, and he was standing in front of her with the rehearsed contrition of someone who had prepared this speech in the car on the way over and believed sincerely in its effectiveness. She had raised him. She knew every register of his voice. "Brandon," she said quietly, "when did you find out about the archive?" He hesitated. "Just barely. Just long enough." "The news segment," he admitted, "which ran 6 weeks ago," Cecile said. "You've had my number for 4 months. Tamara started to say something. Cecile held up one hand, gently but with absolute finality. "Let me tell you what happened after you left me on that sidewalk," she said. "I spent 2 nights without a roof. I ate at a church because I couldn't afford food. I bought this train car for $8 at an auction, while people looked at me the way people look at someone they've already decided doesn't matter. I lived through a West Virginia winter in an unheated freight car, waking up every morning and choosing to keep going because the alternative was accepting that you were right about me." She let that settle. "You called me a burden," she continued. "You said it without flinching. And I want you to understand that those words followed me into every cold morning and every hard day for months, not because they were true, but because they came from my children and some part of me hadn't finished believing that my children saw me clearly. Brandon looked at the ground. Tamara's eyes were wet. "I don't hate you," Cecile said, and meant it completely. "I raised you and I love you in the way that doesn't switch off regardless of what people do. But love and trust are separate things, and you spent mine without knowing what it cost me to give it. I won't do that again." She gestured at the train car behind her. "This is mine. I found it, and I saved it, and I earned it with my own hands during the hardest months of my life. I am the caretaker of something that matters, something that a woman who lived 100 years ago built and documented and preserved because she believed her work had value even when no one would confirm that for her. I understand her completely." She looked at her children steadily. "You are welcome to visit the archive as members of the public. If you want a relationship with me built on honesty and genuine respect, I am open to that conversation. But I will not pretend October didn't happen. I will not make it easy because it is convenient for you now. Whatever we build from here, if we build anything, will be built slowly and honestly or not at all." Brandon looked up. His expression had moved past the rehearsed version of itself into something rawer and less managed. "We're sorry, Mom," he said. "I know that's not enough." "It's a start," Cecile said. "Come back when you're ready to mean it all the way through." They left without argument, which told her more than anything else they could have said. Owen appeared from behind the storage unit where he had been doing maintenance work and had clearly stayed carefully out of sight throughout. He handed her a cup of coffee without comment. They stood together looking at the place Cecile had built from $8 and determination and the particular stubbornness of a woman who had decided that being discarded was not the same as being finished. "You all right?" Owen asked. "I'm exactly all right," Cecile said. On the evening of her 68th birthday, Cecile Pruitt sat on a folding chair outside the train car and watched the sun go down behind the West Virginia tree line, while Owen and Nadine and Dr. Vance and a dozen people from the surrounding community celebrated around her. Dr. Vance announced that a paper co-authored with Cecile about the Marr archive had been accepted by a National Journal of Industrial History. Nadine brought a cake. Owen brought tools wrapped in newspaper because he always brought tools. Josephine Marr had built something extraordinary and been erased by a world that wasn't ready to see her. Cecile had found her and restored her to the record. In doing so, she had restored something in herself, the knowledge that value doesn't require permission, that strength doesn't require an audience, and that sometimes the thing everyone overlooks is the most important thing in the room. She had been called a burden and thrown away at 67 years old with $43 to her name. She had bought a locked train car for $8 of those dollars, while a crowd looked at her with amusement and dismissal. She had survived a winter, built a life, and uncovered a piece of history that had been waiting a century for someone stubborn enough to find it. The tree line turned gold and then dark. The voices of the people around her rose and fell in the evening air. The sign beside the train car caught the last of the fading light. Marr Archive, established 1902, recovered 2024. Cecile Pruitt, discoverer, custodian, home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.